The Chicago Bears made kind of an abrupt and unexpected change on their defensive line, and it feels like they kind of did Jeremiah Attaochu dirty.
You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lorin Cox. I'm here to bring you your daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. You can follow me on Twitter at CoxSports1. You can follow the podcast on Twitter at Locked On Bears. You can like Locked On Bears on Facebook. Join the Locked On Bears Facebook group for even more Bears talk. And make sure you hit that subscribe button on the Locked On Bears YouTube channel to keep up with all of our video podcasts as well. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today and hopefully every day. On the show today, we get into the free agent switch. The Bears release defensive end / formerly outside linebacker Jeremiah Attaochu. They sign nose tackle Mike Pennel. We'll kind of check in on why it feels like this is a little bit, crappy and a little bit, just doing Itauchi a little bit dirty. The NFL's business, well, I understand, but we'll kind of get, okay, Bears save some salary cap space, some post-June 1st stuff there, but like 5 days after they just had him talk to the media about how excited he was to be in this defense, just, rubs me a little bit the wrong way. We'll kind of check in on the defensive line depth as a whole and how they're still sitting pretty good at that defensive end spot, and we're especially sitting good before they cut Itauchi. We'll circle over to the nose tackle spot with Mike Pennel coming in, and how the Bears, seem to make this addition now while we're still waiting for them to make an addition on the offensive line, and sort of wondering about the timing of this compared to the other needs on this roster that still need to be addressed. But I want to start with Itauchi and feeling like this was just kind of, not the ideal way of going about it. And I always will understand that, yes, the NFL is a business, and Jeremiah Attaochu specifically isn't a player that's necessarily, earned the veteran type of quote-unquote, respect that teams might give other players in terms of how they go about moving on from them and sort of doing them a solid in terms of how their release and or trade type of situation is handled. And Itauchi is not, a totally unproven young player by any means, but he's not, the Danny Trevathan, Akeem Hicks, Khalil Mack level of established proven veteran that might get a little bit of a better treatment on the way out. The reason why this feels crappy is because it was just last week, the middle of last week, 5 days ago, the Bears had Itauchi speak to the media for the first time all off season, and was just one of the 4 players they chose. They could have chose anybody on the roster. It's totally up to them. I don't even think it's in this case right now, a media request thing. It's not like they put in Itauchi on a list of what player do we really want to talk to today? It's who do the Bears choose to put out in front of them? And Itauchi talked about I'm excited to be in this scheme, excited to be in this defense. He spent most of his career as a 3-4 outside linebacker, including last year with the Chicago Bears. And it talked about how he was excited to be back in a 4-3 defense, which he did briefly in college. He's going to play that defensive end position, which we weren't even completely sure where exactly he was going to fit, if they were going to try and make him an off-ball linebacker or make him a pure edge pass rusher. And he talked about how he was appreciative of that opportunity to play a defense like this, where he doesn't really have to think about dropping back into coverage or think as much about gaps in run defense. He still has a gap as the defensive end, but there's a little bit less to it when you're a hand in the dirt defensive lineman. It's more about getting off of the ball as quickly as possible, and there's less for him to think about at that position compared to the 3-4 outside linebacker spot. And so 5 days after letting him kind of, for the first time all offseason, see the public light and share about his role and his excitement, gone. Just like that, for a free agent who has been available the entire time, right? It's not as though Mike Pennel was just released yesterday by his former team and, okay, now that he's available, Bears got to cut somebody. They have extra depth at defensive end. Go get your nose tackle now. Like, Mike Pennel was an unrestricted free agent at the start of free agency. As far as I can tell, wasn't like recovering from any sort of major offseason surgery that was publicly reported that like, oh, that's why the Bears waited until now to sign him, right? There doesn't seem to be any specific reason that we can tell from the outside as to why Pennell was the signing now. Perhaps it's an indication how they feel about the nose tackle position, which we'll get to in a minute, but why they would then wait until June 13th when they actually release Itauchi as well. Like if they were planning on eventually this offseason releasing Itauchi because as a post-June 1st cut, the Bears are going to save just under $2.5 million in salary cap space. Itauchi is a player we've looked at all offseason as a potential low-level salary cap casualty. And it made sense that because Trevathan and Tariq Cohen were the maximum two players that they could designate as post-June 1st cuts early, that maybe they would wait until June 1st to cut Itauchi. But June 1st came, June 2nd came, June 3rd, a whole 13, or I guess it has to go June 2nd, so a whole like 11 days really after we thought they might cut him, they then come around and make the cut. Having had all this time to sign Pennell, having had all this time to release Itauchi, it just feels weird. Like if they hadn't had him talk to the media yesterday, I don't think it would have been, or I mean last week, we talked about some of those discussions on yesterday's podcast, it wouldn't have felt like as big of a thing, but now it just feels feels crappy, right? I understand the NFL is a business. Like I said at the beginning, he hasn't earned like preferential treatment in that way, but I don't know, man. It just rubs me the wrong way when he's a player that there's no obvious reason as to why they went about it in this exact way, but it does leave them now with an extra $2.5 million, just under, in cap space to now put them at $24.66 million in salary cap space. Just sitting out there right now, available for them to use. We'll get into what's left at the defensive end position and then what the deal is with this salary cap space and why they're not using it besides by now Mike Pennel, I suppose, next on Locked On Bears. This episode of Locked On Bears is brought to you by our friends at BlueNile.com, and they're here to help you make the jewelry purchasing process so much easier. You can celebrate all of life's special moments at BlueNile.com, from creating the custom engagement ring of your dreams to gifting a classic and timeless jewelry piece, all at prices that you won't find at traditional jewelers. Blue Nile's been doing this online for years and years and years, an established track record, hundreds of thousands of satisfied customers ever since. So whether you're ready to pop the question or you're celebrating a milestone moment, find jewelry as unique as her with the modern convenience of online shopping at BlueNile.com. No matter what you're looking for, they are here to help. Blue Nile has jewelry experts on hand 24/7 to help you find the perfect gift. Every order is fully insured, it ships for free, and it arrives in discreet packaging that won't give away what's inside. So make your moment sparkle with jewelry from BlueNile.com. Locked On Bears listeners are going to get $50 off your purchase of $500 or more. It's a podcast exclusive that includes engagement. Just use our promo code Locked On. That's LOCKEDON. Shop stress-free and find your forever peace. Go to BlueNile.com today. Before the Bears cut Jeremiah Attaochu, it seemed like they were sitting in a pretty good spot depth-wise at defensive end. And I still think they are. It just... I was thinking about something I was planning on bringing up on the podcast at some point here of just how much depth they had at defensive end once you sort of established Itauchi at that position. And the way I was originally going to go about it, I think, the thought I was thinking was like, does that leave them in a better position to eventually be able to trade Robert Quinn? Now that Itauchi has been released, it does change the dynamics on it a little bit, but Robert Quinn is still a Chicago Bear. He hasn't arrived and shown up for any of the practices as far as we know just yet, but he is still under contract, and the team has sort of more or less indicated they expect him to show up when he is required to show up and just isn't here for the voluntary portions of the offseason program. But like when you look at the defensive end position, of course, Robert Quinn, one starter. When he's here, assuming he will be here for the regular season. That's locked in. Your other starter is probably locked. I mean, locked in is a strong word. There's going to be a rotation with all these guys. So the starter designation is not as important. But your other starter at this point is probably Al-Quadin Muhammad, who they signed from the Indianapolis Colts, was, I don't want to say a staple of Matt Eberflus's defense in Indianapolis, but was a 17-game starter at that defensive end position last year. It was kind of his first full year in that starting role, had 6 sacks. Didn't have as many sacks as Travis Gibson, who is going to compete for that starting spot and may very well end up as that starting defensive end. But regardless, I don't think the quote-unquote starter in that situation is going to make a huge difference because there is going to be a lot of rotation. And I would bet, regardless of who the starter is and who the backup is, they're probably going to play a similar number of snaps this season. Maybe the starter will play 100 more. Maybe one will play 600, one will play 500. But over the course of a season, it'll be fairly regular of a rotation through them. Those three were for sure going to be pretty much your top 3. Jeremiah Attaochu was going to be easily there, number 4 in that rotation. He's now out of the mix. And with Itauchi, it would have made the rookie Dominique Robinson number 5, like maybe even a risk to miss the 53-man roster and rarely get playing time, if any, in that rotation because there were just 4 quality players ahead of him on that depth chart. So now Robinson can step in more of that 4th edge rusher role, which I think is still a pretty good spot to be in. You wouldn't want him to be your 3 or let alone one of your starters as a 5th-round pick who's still learning the position. But as the number 4, you can do worse. I mean, you might ideally want better. They do have like Sam Kamara, who's been sort of around this team for a couple of seasons as a 4-3 defense, as an edge rusher and now a 4-3 defensive end. Charles Snowden also potentially going to be in that conversation there. And then we're still figuring out exactly what Mario Edwards Jr.'s role is going to look like in this scheme. He's one of those players I'm really interested in hearing from this offseason. He's also another player that, at least earlier in the year, earlier in the summer, or I guess spring, was not present at the voluntary minicamp practices and have not heard of him being back yet. But I guess I haven't specifically heard of him still not being there. It's still up in the air for me as to whether or not Mario Edwards is there or not. But we would hear as soon as Robert Quinn returns to Bears practice. That one would be a little bit more of a headline getter, but he has not been there for these voluntary workouts. And as far as I know, Mario Edwards hasn't been either. I don't think that's necessarily a sign that he's going to be traded, but more so I'm curious whether he's going to play the 3-technique defensive tackle or that 4-3 defensive end position. Because last year in this Bears scheme, and in the last 2 seasons really of him in Vic Fangio, Sean Desai's 3-4 defense, Mario Edwards was that Akeem Hicks position, right? The 3-4 defensive end on the inside, and then in passing situations, he played more of that 3-technique defensive tackle that Justin Jones is going to play in this Bears scheme. So presumably, you might think he would line up there and be in that rotation as good 3-technique depth for Justin Jones. And that's probably, given if you look at the defensive tackle depth chart, it's a little bit thin at that spot in particular. So I would assume that Edwards will probably end up playing there. But early in Edwards' career when he was with the New Orleans Saints, and I think he may have been asked to play it a little bit in a couple of other stops, but especially right away with the Raiders before that, and then it was Raiders early in his career, then the Giants and the Saints. He played that 4-3 defensive end position, and so do the Bears ask him to stay bulked up and play the defensive tackle spot? Do they ask him to slim down a little bit and play the edge rusher spot? Or do they see him as a hybrid player who can rotate in both? And maybe you feel like in where you ever want to put him depth-wise, you want to throw some different rotations out there. He's the wild card here that I'm curious to see, because if he's at the 4-3 defensive end spot, that pushes Robinson down the depth chart. He's probably number 4 in that rotation, maybe number 3 in there with Gibson. If he's playing the 3-technique spot, he's right behind Justin Jones, getting some reps in there. Do you let him do both? Do you just kind of throw him wherever you can find some open snaps there? Because clearly Mike Pennel is going to come in here as a nose tackle option. That's more of what he was doing in Kansas City last season, or excuse me, Atlanta last season, and Kansas City a couple of seasons before that. He's more that 330-pound defensive lineman. They'll kick him out sometimes to that 3 technique spot. He can play a little bit of both, but we saw, especially I think in the Kansas City Chiefs defense with Ryan Poles, where he was sort of overseeing that, you really saw him and play a lot of that nose tackle position, and then sort of in passing situations, if they spread out their whole defensive line, then he'd be more at that 3 technique spot. So I like the addition where you have some lack of depth at that nose tackle spot, because it was Angelo Blackson and Kyrus Tonga sort of rotating there, and then Pennell can maybe do a little bit of both with Justin Jones there. So then does that make Mario Edwards more flexible and expendable to be able to line up at a bunch of different spots? It's clear that this is a key priority for this new regime when you look at how much they've turned over that defensive line position in particular, and now adding that sort of late addition here. But it just makes me wonder, again, back to the timing of this a little bit more. Not this time, not because of Attaochu, but because of okay, why now do you add Pennell to this defensive tackle position when he's been available all offseason, and you've had salary cap space all offseason, and you created even more of it? I mean, you've had some salary cap. It's been limited salary cap space, but Pennell is not a guy who's going to command an expensive contract. This is not an expensive free agent they just signed. We don't know the numbers yet, but it's going to be likely a 1-year deal, likely very close to veteran minimum, no more than a couple $1 million at the absolute most. And so all throughout this process, the Bears have had enough to afford that. After June 1st, they had a lot more to afford that. And now with the Tauscher being cut, they have a lot of salary cap space. So why add the nose tackle now, but still not adding other players at other positions of need with this salary cap space? We'll kind of look at some of the timing of this and the player evaluation process at this stage of the offseason versus training camp next on Locked On Bears. At this stage of the offseason, betting on football might not be the first thing that comes to your mind, but our friends at betonline.net are going to be your source for all of your sports betting needs, the information, the news, the notes, everything. And you can bet ahead on this football season on your Chicago Bears. The win total this season set at over under 6.5. Long shot odds to make the playoffs. Could be a good return on investment if you're confident in those Bears surprising everybody this season. Week 1 odds, Bears are 6.5-point underdogs to the San Francisco 49ers as well. Plus, BetOnline has all of your sports betting needs. The NBA Finals, NHL, Stanley Cup Final now coming right around the corner, I think just tomorrow. Major League Baseball in the thick of that season. And of course, all the latest fighting news from MMA to UFC to boxing. They do esports, they do live betting, and so much more. BetOnline is going to be the continued source for all of your sports wagering information. Head on over to their website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends and action you need to know. BetOnline, where the game starts. The Bears haven't added that true, consistent, solid veteran free agent to shore up the biggest need on their offensive line and also some still lingering needs at wide receiver. And so it surprises me that at this stage they go and add the defensive lineman, because my working theory that how to make sense of this in my head was that, well, at this stage of the offseason, the players don't have pads on. So you can't fully evaluate your offensive lineman. You can't fully evaluate how well Sam Mustipher is doing at right guard versus Dakota Dozier, Tevin Jenkins, Larry Borum, Braxton Jones at tackle. You can get some sense of how they move and how they're handling different responsibilities that you put on them. But as Matt Eberflus himself said on yesterday's podcast, things change when you put the pads on. And that's really when you can start to evaluate these guys. That's true of the offensive line. I would think then it's equally true of the defensive line. So somewhere in this process, they were able to make some evaluation of the defensive line and feel as though they needed to add Mike Pennel to this defensive line. And yet they don't seem to be in a position to evaluate the offensive line to add a guard or a tackle. And I don't want to make this too oversimplified, because yes, there are other factors that can go into this, right? Because there's two sides to signing a free agent. The free agent has to want to come to the Chicago Bears for the price that the Chicago Bears are willing to sign them. And so if the Bears are looking at certain offensive line free agents like Darrell Williams or some of the other options, and maybe that player has a certain price tag in mind to play for Chicago, and Chicago has a certain price tag in mind to sign a player of that caliber, and says, you know what, well, we're still not there on the numbers, but circle around in training camp and see maybe if that player's price tag comes down, or if the Bears' need and desperation, that's the word I'm looking for, comes up. Right? It's not as simple as just Bears refuse to sign offensive linemen while signing defensive linemen. I know it's not that simple and not that black and white, but I just can't help but feel strange about this because, again, it's not like Mike Pennel just became available out of nowhere and that's why they signed him now. Like, why did they sign this nose tackle now? I'm like trying to think of like the explanations. The main one I would think is that they see what they've got on the defensive line and says, you know what, we need to add a veteran that's a little more consistent, that has some familiarity with Ryan Poles from his time in Kansas City, was actually on the Bears last preseason, so has played with some of these players and has been in this organization at least for a short period of time. Because otherwise, what has been the wait and why sign him now as opposed to, 12 days ago when you added cap space, or 3 months ago when free agency opened up? Right? He's been a free agent the whole time. They've had, the type of need for it. I mean, did Pennell's price tag all of a sudden just come down? He said, screw it, I want to get in a team and get to OTAs and start working my way ahead of training camp, so I'm not coming in so late with a better chance to make the 53-man roster. Like, that doesn't quite satisfy my answer. Like, it feels to me like they saw a need on the defensive line and said, okay, let's go get somebody. That's like, usually I would say the vast majority of the time, the reason you sign a free agent, right? It's like, we see that we could use an additional player. This player is available. Let's sign him. So how are they able to see that on the defensive line and not see that on the offensive line, where it just seems like the need should be so much more glaring on paper, right? That Dakota Dozier has consistently been very, very bad in the NFL. Sam Mustipher struggled at center, and so do we trust fully that he's going to be great at guard, which, oh, by the way, they just rotated him into the second team to get Dozier some first-team reps. Not necessarily a benching, not necessarily an evaluation of Mustipher per se. They're going to rotate guys. The same thing with Tevin Jenkins. We're not going to overreact to it. But, you can't help but just wonder, like, are they more confident in the offensive line than we are? Are they more confident in the offensive line than they should be? Is it just about, well, any player that they see as an upgrade doesn't want to come on their price tag or come to Chicago right now in this situation? When they look at the offensive line free agents, they say, okay, there are 5 guys. Pick a number. There are 5 guys that we see as upgrades. And right now, we can't reach an agreement with any of those 5 guys. So we're not going to just sign some random free agent just to sign somebody that we don't think is actually going to improve our offensive line. And so that's why they haven't signed one, but they did see Pennell as the upgrade that they needed, and maybe they do recognize the need on the offensive line, and just for whatever reason can't get a player in the building. I find that, implausible or hard to believe. Like I said, I'm looking for a logical explanation here as to like why this signing happens now, but same thing at wide receiver, another wide receiver, a veteran. Not that there's just a plethora of great options out there that are just waiting for the Bears to sign them, but it just seems like if you can either have the excuse of, well, it's too early to evaluate these players, so we're going to wait till training camp before they add somebody else, but then that doesn't really fly with the Mike Pennel explanation. So I'm left unsure. I'm concerned that they don't fully see how big of an issue the offensive line is, but if they were able to figure out on the defensive line, you would think, and the defensive line doesn't even seem like as huge of a concern. I trust, Justin Jones, Angelo Blackson, and Kyrus Tonga, and maybe Mario Edwards in that rotation more than I do either of the right guards. You know what I mean? And plus you have these offensive tackle changes and trying to figure that. There's multiple positions on the offensive line where wouldn't hurt to bring in a veteran. Just a proven veteran, more proven than Julian Davenport and Sean Coleman, who they've signed already this offseason, that are not in any way, shape, or form guaranteed a 53-man roster spot. And that should be true to say, too, for Mike Pennel as well, where it's like he's not guaranteed a 53-man roster spot, but he is a veteran who's played snaps, a consistent number of snaps, pretty much every season in his career. Like, I look last year with him with the Atlanta Falcons, he joined them in week 5, I think, off the practice squad, but didn't really make a big role until like week 8 through 18, and he played like 250 snaps. If you compare that to last year, Eddie Goldman played 336 snaps. So like Pennell was playing less than Eddie Goldman, but approaching each season Eddie Goldman number of snaps at nose tackle, where it's like sort of a starter, but rotates a lot out in passing situations. Like, so this is not just some nobody. He's not guaranteed a roster spot, but he's not some nobody. And you would think that type of player would be available right now on the offensive line and would present an upgrade over what they have at right guard and maybe what they have at offensive tackle. And yet it still hasn't happened. And I don't know why. The defensive line signing happens. The offensive line signing hasn't happened yet. Who knows? Maybe it's still in the works. I mean, maybe they're going to do it within the next 24 hours and shut my butt up. But for now, I've got questions and I'm still looking for answers on them. So we'd love to hear your theories. Let us know in the comments here on the Locked On Bears YouTube channel. Tweet us at Locked On Bears. You can comment and post on the Locked On Bears Facebook page, or even join the Locked On Bears Facebook group to get in on more of an intimate discussion there. Hope you'll keep following along and subscribe to the Locked On Bears podcast, wherever you listen to podcasts, to keep up with all of our daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. We've got some cool programming coming up for you here on the Locked On Podcast Network. If you're a basketball fan, the Ultimate NBA Mock Draft starts June 16th. That's Thursday, as I do the math on top of my head, with over 50 insiders. Nothing equals the Ultimate NBA Mock Draft. We got the Locked On NBA Big Board Draft Experts plus Odyssey insiders. First pick is June 16th. Just search Ultimate NBA Mock Draft and follow now so you don't miss any of the picks for your favorite team, whether it's the Bulls or anybody else. No judgment here on the Locked On NBA Ultimate Mock Draft. Some really cool stuff going over there. Locked On Podcast Network is your team every single day, and I hope every day that we do a Locked On Bears podcast, I hope it makes it just a little bit easier for you to bear down.